And there's a little bit of a clue on the board as to what part of history we might be looking at today. So if you can see those two trophies there, if you have a look at them, have a little think, do you know what those trophies are for? I'll give you a few seconds just to have a think and then I'll tell you. Yeah, they're the men's World Cup trophies. This is the old one and this is the new one. Okay, so today is going to be World Cup History Part 1. I'll explain what Part 1 means. And then there'll be a little bit of an assignment at the end, a little bit of homework for you to do so that you can find out more about the Men's World Cup itself. So, I started by saying about the two trophies. This is the old World Cup trophy called the Jules Rimet Trophy. Now, some of you might have heard that name, even if you don't know about the trophy, in the Three Lions football song, which has obviously been very big in English football. And then this is the FIFA World Cup trophy, which is for the newer World Cups. Now, the Jules Rimet Trophy was named after a Frenchman called Jules Rimet, whose idea it was to set up the World Cup. And that every 4 years, there would be a World Cup tournament between the best men's national teams to find out who the best football country is in the world. And for part 1 of the World Cup history class, we're going to talk about this trophy and all of the World Cups from when they very first started. So, the very first World Cup was held many years ago. Does anybody know? Have a little think to yourself, see if you know the answer, when the first World Cup was held. Give a few seconds. Very good. It was in 1930. Okay, 1930 was the first World Cup. And it was held in a country called Uruguay, which is in South America. And I'm going to tell you some little facts now about all of the World Cups leading up to 1970, which was the last time that there was a World Cup played for the Jules Rimet Trophy. Okay, and I'll explain why that is. So I'm going to talk you through the different World Cups from 1930 to 1970, some little facts about the history of the World Cup, and then there'll be an assignment at the end where you can, like I said, find out some facts about World Cups yourself and then show us what you know, and there'll be some prizes for the best work that we get back. So like I said, 1930 was the first World Cup held in Uruguay. And when the World Cup started, the world was a very different place. 91 years ago it is. So teams had to travel in very different ways to get to the World Cup. And because it was in South America in Uruguay, there were only 4 European countries that made the trip, because it was a 3-week boat trip from Europe to South America to play in the World Cup. So very different than flying today. The only way you could fly across the Atlantic from Europe to North America and South America was on an airship, which was very, very expensive, and there weren't any planes that would make that journey, so teams had to go by boat. So obviously a big challenge to spend 3 weeks on a boat and then go and try and win the World Cup. And not really surprisingly, the teams that were closer to Uruguay played for the final. So it was Uruguay and Argentina, countries that are next to each other and didn't have to travel, that played the final, and Uruguay were the first winners of the World Cup. So moving on, we've got 1934 is the next World Cup, because like I said, it's every 4 years that you have a World Cup tournament. And the 1934 World Cup moved to Italy. And a little bit of a theme emerging. Italy were the winners of the first European World Cup. And in the early days, World Cups would transfer from Europe to South America to Europe, and those two continents held most of the World Cups. So the 1934 World Cup was held in Italy and was won by Italy. So then moving on to 1938. As you can see, every 4 years, it's going on to the next tournament. And that was also held in Europe and held in France. And the winners in 1938 were Italy again. So Italy becoming the first team to win 2 World Cups. And then at this stage, South American teams are winning the South American World Cups and European teams are winning the European World Cups. Italy, like I said, becoming the first team to win 2 World Cups. Now, if you think the next World Cup here would be in 1942. Like I said, if you move 4 years on, you get to 1942. But there wasn't a World Cup in 1942. And if you move on from 1942, you get to 1946. And there wasn't a 1946 World Cup. Have a little think. Can anybody think why that might be? Why there were 2 World Cups missed out? And that the next World Cup was in 1950. Yeah. If you thought because of World War II, you would be correct. They missed out those 2 World Cups because the World War II was happening and a World Cup of football wasn't an important thing in the world at that point. So those 2 World Cups were missed and 1950 was the next one. Now that World Cup was held in Brazil again. So you've gone South America, Europe, South America. So the 1950 World Cup was in Brazil. Now Italy were one of the favourites for that one, but because they'd had a bad experience with flying in the run-up to the World Cup, they decided to travel to Brazil by boat. And again, boat travel hadn't got much faster, and they had a 3-week journey. And a little fun fact of that, they brought 50 footballs on board the big ship that made the trip to Brazil. And one of the Italians said every single one of their footballs ended up in the sea. So they ended up with no footballs to train with on the ship and had to do their own fitness work and things like that. So some big challenges, and despite being one of the favourites, when they got to Brazil, they got knocked out quite quickly because they weren't that well prepared, and then they had to go back on the ship, and the return journey was a month on the boat. So nearly 2 months of travelling on the boat to play in the World Cup and get knocked out quite early. So not the best experience for them. Now 1950 was the first year that England went into the World Cup. And they had a good team. They had a player called Sir Stanley Matthews, who's very famous in England. For those of you who work on our skills, Stanley Matthews is one of our dribbling skills, because he was called the Wizard of Dribble, one of the best players in the world. But England had a really terrible World Cup, and they got beaten by a part-time bunch of footballers from the USA, which is one of the biggest shocks in the history of the World Cup, because England was supposed to be one of the favourites, one of the best teams. England had very strong football and had invented the game, and in the early days of the game, England were very strong. So that was a big shock, and England got knocked down. One thing about Stanley Matthews, very famous player and a legend of English football, when he was over there, one of the reasons why he was such a good player is he was so smart off the pitch, did loads of clever things, used to do fasting, used to do special ice baths and salt baths, and he was always thinking about how he could improve his game. And part of the history of football at this time is that the boots were very, very heavy and very hardened leather. I think maybe because the game was rougher and tougher, and maybe they just didn't understand about how you could get yourself to be quicker on the pitch. But Stanley Matthews noticed that the Brazilians had much thinner leather, much softer boots, and much lighter boots in the way that they played. And when he was over there, he decided, oh, that was a good idea. Bought a lot of pairs of boots from Brazilian bootmakers and brought them back to England with him. And then he actually started up his own Stanley Matthews range of football boots. And you can see today, football boots are so light and so good for moving quickly on the pitch. Stanley Matthews, not just a great player, but probably one of the first people to sort of really make that popular and think about how boots could make you play better. But like I said, we're in South America again, and the final was between 2 South American teams. So it was between Brazil and Uruguay actually shocked Brazil to win that World Cup, and it was the world record for an attendance at a football match. There was a few hundred below 200,000 watching the game. So that's over 2 times the amount of people who go to Wembley. So Wembley's a really big football stadium, and it's more than twice that number watch this game. So an amazing tournament, and Uruguay also won 2 World Cups now. So if you move on from 1950, you get to 1954, 4 years later, and the World Cup returns to Europe, and that's in Switzerland. So in Europe, Hungary, and for those of you working on our skills, will know about the Puskás. Puskás was a famous Hungarian player, and Hungary were favourites for the World Cup. In one of their group games, they played West Germany. It was West Germany then, not Germany as we know it today, because it was 2 countries, West Germany and East Germany. And West Germany had played Hungary in the group stage, and Hungary had won 8-3 and absolutely smashed them. But then it came to the final, and Germany won that with a really big upset, beating Hungary in the final 3-2. So very, very good win for West Germany. Germany feature a lot in World Cup history, a very successful country, but as West Germany there, they won their first World Cup. So if you move on to 1958 now, okay, that's another World Cup in Europe, and it's in Sweden. So in this World Cup, it's the first time we see a player called Pelé. Some of you will have heard of Pelé, I hope, because he's a legend of the game, very famous player, and he was 17 years old in this World Cup. He scored 6 goals, and he actually scored 2 in the final. Brazil were really good in this World Cup and won their first World Cup. Pelé scoring 2 in the final, and they beat Sweden 5-2 in the final. So it's the highest scoring World Cup final ever, 5-2. We've had a few 4-2s, which we'll come on to, but that's the first time that Pelé played in the World Cup. And it was really successful for British teams, because Wales and Northern Ireland also qualified for the quarterfinals. So it is a good World Cup for British teams. Moving 4 years on, so Brazil won their first World Cup in 1962, moves from Europe to South America in a country called Chile. And again, Brazil, a very good team. Pelé gets injured and doesn't play all the way to the final, but another Brazilian called Garrincha, he had one leg that was noticeably longer than the other. Some people have legs that are a bit longer, but his were really noticeable. But he was the player of the tournament, even with his uneven legs, because it kind of gave him a really funny way of moving with the ball, but really hard for the defenders to read. And Brazil, in this, they won the final against a country called Czechoslovakia. Now, these days, you don't see Czechoslovakia because it's now 2 separate countries. It divided into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So if you see those when you're looking at international football, that's why. But they were together as Czechoslovakia, got all the way to the final, and we're a very strong football country, but Brazil win the second World Cup. We now come on to probably the most famous one for English people, is the 1966 World Cup. So it's a very famous year for English football. We, as England, hosted the World Cup, and we would actually win the World Cup as well, which was an amazing achievement. And again, said about West Germany previously, England got all the way to the final, beating many of the best teams in the tournament. Argentina, who were very strong, Portugal, who had a legend of football called Eusebio playing for them. England beat them in the semi-finals, 2 goals by a famous player called Sir Bobby Charlton. He was one of England's best players in that World Cup, scored 2 goals in the semi-final, and England got all the way to the final. And the final was a very, very famous game. England versus West Germany at Wembley, and after normal time, it was 2-2, and the game went into extra time. And in extra time, England score a goal that is still very controversial today. You can't tell very well on replays if the ball goes over the line, because it hits the bar, bounces down, on the line, over the line. Depends if you're a German or an English person, depending on whether you think it was a goal or not. And after that goal, the striker Jeff Hurst scores a goal right at the end of extra time, so England win the game 4-2. That actually gave Jeff Hurst a hat-trick. Hat-trick's 3 goals, and Jeff Hurst became the first and only player to score a hat-trick in a World Cup final. So, very good for England. We move on to the next World Cup now. It's 1970, and that's the first one that's not held in England, sorry, not England, in Europe or in South America. It's held in a country called Mexico. Mexico's just into North America, but a very big football country and very big in World Cup history. So we get to 1970. England go to the 1970 World Cup in Mexico as the reigning champions with a strong team. But in the group, they're drawn against Brazil, who are the favourites. And this 1970 World Cup is very famous because of that Brazil team. Brazil had one of the greatest teams ever to play football and had some amazing players. And England lost to Brazil in the group stage, and then England would get knocked out again by West Germany. West Germany coming up again, very strong football team. But Brazil were the stars of this World Cup and went all the way through to the final, beating Italy 4-1 in the final. There's some amazing things about that team. They had wonderful players. They had a winger called Jairzinho, who's still the only player to score in every round of the World Cup. So he scored in every group match, quarterfinals, semi-finals and final. He scored 7 goals altogether. And it was the last World Cup that Pelé played in. Pelé was an amazing player. And in winning this World Cup, Pelé became the only player to win 3 World Cup tournaments. And this brings us to the end of the Jules Rimet World Cup and the end of the part 1 of World Cup history. Because by winning the Jules Rimet 3 times, Brazil got to keep the trophy. Okay, so that's why there are 2 World Cup trophies, and that's why after 1970 it changed to the FIFA World Cup trophy. And that's going to be the topic of our next history lesson. Now, for you, what we want you to do a little bit of research, try and find out yourself a little bit about history, is we would like you to pick any World Cup tournament. So it could be any of these, but it could be any of them that go up all the way through to the last World Cup. Does anybody remember what the date of the last World Cup was? Okay, good. It was 2018, and just as a little reminder, that was in Russia. So you can choose any of these World Cup tournaments, and what we would like you to do is to pick that tournament and then do 5 interesting facts about that World Cup. So it could be any little facts that you want. The more obscure, the more interesting, the better. So for example, if you pick 1966, you could say, one of your facts could be that the World Cup trophy was stolen by some thieves and it was discovered by a dog called Pickles. So that could be one of your fun facts. And for 1950, if that was your one, it could be that India qualified for the World Cup, but one of the reasons why they declined to enter the 1950 World Cup was because they were told they wouldn't be allowed to play in bare feet. Okay, quite interesting, isn't it? I don't know why you want to play in bare feet in 1950 when they had big, heavy boots, but maybe that's the way that they were used to play. So, for example, if you pick a World Cup tournament, so it could be 1986, and then there'd be 5 key facts, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, and then what we would like you to do is do your little facts file of 5 key facts about a World Cup tournament, and then if you can send them through on a piece of paper, a photo of that piece of paper to the WhatsApp number that's just going to come up below, and then the coaches will go through. Hopefully they'll be entertaining, hopefully they'll be interesting and funny and things that we haven't seen before, and the best one, there'll be a little prize that we give out for that. So I hope you've found the first part interesting. and learn some things that are a bit different that you didn't know about the World Cup. And then hopefully you go and find some extra facts about the World Cup that you choose, and you can learn more and also find out a little bit more about how you can find out things. Because there's some really good websites. The FIFA World Cup website, there's a little bit of a clue, has some really interesting things for every World Cup tournament. All right, but good luck with the work, and we'll see you next week for the second part of World Cup history.